Getting you prepared for this weekend's action in the NCAA Final Four, both men's and women's, the SportsGrid network right here. We get you covered, and also on the early line, no doubt about it, Donnie Rightside and Joe Raineri. Let's take a look. First, let's set the table for this weekend, right? Because we have some look-ahead lines that I want to get to, which I think are very interesting if these games play out the way we think they're going to play out, or maybe an upset or two. But the two games this weekend, NC State and Purdue, followed by Alabama and Connecticut. This is rare here because typically you're going to get one game which we think are better than the other game, which means we expect a close game, 1.5 point spread, 2.5 point spread. We're not getting that this weekend. The 6:09 matchup on Saturday between NC State and Purdue, that sits at 9.5 points. Game number two, Alabama and Connecticut, 11.5 points here. Are we going to see an upset this weekend? Is it going to be chalky? And also, Joe, how do you approach this weekend with two heavy lines here?
Yeah, heavy line. I mean, listen, the reality is, Donnie, I hope it is chalky because I think it's the best game possible for the championship with UConn taking on Purdue. So any sort of update here, and it's not happening with Connecticut. Let's be realistic. Can NC State win? Sure, they can win. But, maybe I'd be more apt to wait until this thing hits double digits, and I think it will here, Donnie. I mean, we saw 9s, then it was 9.5, and I do think there'll be some Purdue money coming in on before game day and maybe push this thing up to 10. I don't think it'll stay there, but I do think you'll have an opportunity to get double digits with NC State if that's what you want to do here. I think NC State has the best shot of keeping this thing close and maybe the number. I don't think Alabama has any shot at keeping it close against UConn. I think it opened up 10.5. It's now up to 12, and I still wouldn't take the points in that spot there. It's not a great matchup for Alabama, period. In fact, they have maybe been favored the most by some of the games and teams that they have had to play to this point. All of those advantages will not work in their favor against UConn.
Usually in some of those regional rounds, you might get some of those stadiums that you play in. We'll talk about stadiums, football stadiums. Haven't had that yet in the NCAA tournament. You're going to get that this weekend in Arizona. A lot of lofty totals here that we're looking at, that we're expecting teams to just pick up where they left off in a new environment on some rest, and the other team with a few more days to get prepared. But it should be fun to watch. I was talking yesterday on Moneyline with Kevin Walsh, saying to myself, look, even if we have to sacrifice, Joe, as you said, for the greater good, where it is two blowouts, and it is Purdue that wins, and it is UConn that wins, we're set up for an unbelievable matchup Monday night that certainly is going to be so much fun to watch it play out. So at the FanDuel Sportsbook, they give us some hypothetical odds in these matchups that we can't anticipate. And if it turns out that we get chalk on Saturday night, both top teams advance here, and it is Purdue and Connecticut on Monday night, -5.5 as this line here for the Connecticut Huskies and the Purdue Boilermakers, obviously of the underdogs, getting the 5.5 here. Talk to me on this line, because we can break down this matchup, obviously, but the line itself, what would this line be after the games end on Saturday night? Like, Joe, if you see Connecticut absolutely hammers Alabama and Purdue struggles with NC State, could we see 6.5 and 7.5, or vice versa if Purdue absolutely rolls and Connecticut struggles a little bit? Where does this line end up on Monday?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating, Donnie, just from the standpoint of, you're right, recency bias. What kind of is the initial reaction we're going to get based upon the outcomes that we see in the games? You're already in a Final Four having both games looking like double-digit favorites is kind of crazy. So the market is kind of telling us, Donnie, don't expect great things. So if UConn and Purdue win by margin and win the games rather easily, I do think you're going to have UConn won it last year. You're going to have maybe, now we're dealing with the UConn on the women's side. You might have a little UConn fatigue here along the way, maybe giving you an opportunity to get a better number on them, because a lot of people might jump on Purdue here. I mean, if Purdue barely wins, or is, fortunate where NC State takes them to the wire, then I think you're going to get all sorts of UConn money coming in. And then that number, don't wait Purdue, wait for it, because that Connecticut money will come in if they blow out Alabama and Purdue struggles with NC State.
Without seeing those games on Saturday, if I ask you right now and say, okay, they're both going to win, but we don't know the process through it. If it is 5.5 points, who are you leaning towards? UConn or Purdue on Monday night if that line is identical and both teams don't really rise and shine, let's just say, on Saturday?
Nobody, as far as I'm concerned, is beating UConn. I don't care what the number is. And not because of it offensively, but because of what they have done defensively that nobody is talking about. Now, we know Klingon, we know these guys are phenomenal offensively, but what they are doing defensively is kind of not being talked about enough here. We're talking about a UConn team that has actually upped their defensive game against better offensive teams. 8 of the 11 top 25 rated offensive teams against UConn have gone under their total when they have played them. They have been ridiculous. What they just did to Illinois should tell you that Alabama is going to be in for it because Illinois was a top 5 offensively rated team in the country. They were elite offensively, Donnie, and they scored 52 points. 52, and that's not an anomaly. UConn's defense has raised their game, going to make it very difficult, I think, for teams like Alabama who only have one pitch. They're either hitting threes or they're not. You take that away for them. How did they beat UConn, Donnie? I don't see it happening. So I do think Connecticut, no matter what happens and who they play, defensively, they are just a notch above everything else that we see at this point.
Let's just say DJ Horne and DJ Burns Jr. have an unbelievable game and knock off Purdue here and face UConn. UConn would be a 15.5 point favorite over NC State. Now, here's the interesting part about that, because I'm with you. I don't think anybody's beating UConn at this point right now. They just look like the most complete team, and it doesn't matter who stands in their way, which I do want to see them play Purdue because I think it will be quite fun to break it down and watch it play out. But NC State, let's just say they do beat Purdue. You can't get a hotter basketball team playing their absolute peak best right now. I actually would take the 15.5 points if NC State was taking on UConn, and it was a 15.5 point number, Joe. How about you?
Yeah, listen, it's this and what is it, 9 now in a row, right? I mean, just a absolutely unbelievable, magical run here by NC State that has gotten a ton of breaks and everything go their way in a lot of different situations here. So kudos, right? I mean, they're here. But I do think eventually they were going to run into a team that is just that much better. And once that regression hits, which it will, Donnie, they're not going to outshoot every team they play through a championship from 3-point range. They weren't a great 3-point shooting team. They're making great shots at great times, but I just think styles make fight. And Purdue, with Zach Edey and the snipers they have around them, that's going to be unlike anything NC State has had to play thus far. And again, NC State has played their A game the entire way. What happens if their B game shows up, which eventually it will here, Donnie, against Purdue? That's lights out.
Let's just say Purdue does advance and wins their game against NC State, but also Alabama pulls the rug out from under UConn and shows up on Monday night to play for a national championship, which means probably you got some great tempo and the 3 balls were rolling. But if we take a look at this lineup here, Purdue then turns into the favorite at -5.5 going up against Alabama. So talk to us about this matchup, because if Alabama is pulling punches here, knocking off some of the best teams in the country, which includes UConn, I got to be honest, Joe, I'm taking the 5.5 points here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, you'd have to. No doubt in that. If anybody, but then you got the other thing, right? So if Alabama somehow knocks off UConn, it's going to require a monster effort. And then we've got the problem of no matter who they're facing, it's a letdown, because this is Alabama's national championship game against the champs, UConn. If you beat them, I'd be very worried about what's left in the tank come the championship game for Alabama. I don't see it happening, but if it did, I would be worried to see what do they have left for either Purdue or NC State.
Exactly. You get that monster victory. It's almost like you already won the national championship before even getting to the game, because beating UConn would be that top dog, and what a letdown that would be is you can't finish it off. But there are some still, and one more matchup, I should say, to take a look at. That's NC. I'm telling you right now, The NCAA executives are lining this up going, we might have hit the grandest of slams you could ever hit with the women's national championship and the men's national championship, the way it sets up. If we wind up with NC State, Alabama, will we love it? Yes. Will be a lot of fun because they're two good teams. But my goodness, we would sit back and say, Joe, what could have been here? Purdue and UConn was supposed to be that major lineup. Now we would find ourselves on Monday night with a 4 seed and an 11 seed playing for the national championship, and an Alabama Crimson Tide team at the FanDuel Sportsbook would be favored by 4.5 points over NC State.
Yeah, but the odds aren't in that fair. I mean, listen, the history of the tournament, Donnie, right? We all love Cinderellas. We all love the underdog story. We get it. But the reality is, throughout history, over the decades in this tournament, the cream always rises to the top, the way it is set up. And eventually you're going to get, a couple of number ones like you have here against a couple of other pretty decent teams. We've never had an 11 seed win a national championship. I doubt very much NC State is going to be the first one to ever do it, or Alabama even at a 4 seed. Although I think UConn last year was, a 4 or a 6 seed when they won it last year. But that was your outlier. Yeah, they were a 4, I think. But that was the outlier. You had FAU, which was an 8 seed or 9 seed, somewhere in that ballpark. The Final Four was just, it was an anomaly last year. This year, a couple of number ones that I think are just a cut above. And they usually, history tells us, those number 1 seeds are there for a reason. And they usually have more depth and more talent than anybody else. And I think that's exactly what we're going to see here.
Lining up this weekend's Final Four heading into the national championship game that's going to take place on Monday night. Looking at the FanDuel Sportsbook, the odds is listed here. UConn a minus 185 price to win it all. Purdue at a plus 190, followed by Alabama at 13-1 and NC State at 20-1. Also, Joe, if you just want to say, you know what? Connecticut is the best, but maybe one of these teams can still knock them off. You could take the field. Connecticut is a minus 184 price. The field would get you plus 146. So my question to you, Joe, is would you be more likely to say, well, really the only team I think that can knock them off would be Purdue. I'll take the plus 190 price. Or do you maybe see an upset and you'll take the other 3 teams for a plus 146 total package?
Yeah. Now, while you may think you're getting value by taking the field, let me just remind everyone, if they don't win, you lose. And I don't see any of them winning anything except one more game and the right to eventually lose to UConn. I think they're that good. I think they're that experienced, and they are playing hard to believe. They still can't hit any threes, Donnie. They went 3 of 17 against Illinois and beat them by 25.
Yep.
We talked about the Yankees lineup. What happens when they start hitting? What happens when they start hitting threes, UConn? Which could very well happen here this weekend. It's going to be lights out. I would only lay the 185, and I don't do that very often.
It's absolutely crazy. It's absolutely wild the way it's going to play out. But you're right about that. 2 teams that didn't hit water from a boat from 3-point range, both advance. Imagine if they both bring their A games here, win on Saturday, and then advance to Monday night's championship game. And by the way, SportsGrid Network, we got you covered all weekend long. This absolutely is the place to be.